Hello and welcome to the class. Today's discussion is about role of UN Human Rights Treaty monitoring bodies and protection of women's rights. To begin with, international treaties are some of the agreements between and among the nations. One of the main objectives of such global treaties is to impose binding obligations on the states who are parties to such agreements. However, it is equally true that the UN support for the rights of women began with the organization's founding charter. Among the purpose of the UN Declaration in Article 1 of its charter is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language or religion. The Economic and Social Council established its Commission on the Status of Women as the principal global policy-making body dedicated exclusively to gender equality and advancement of women. The landmark Universal Declaration adopted by the General Assembly on 10th December 1948, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, birth or other status. When we are talking about the UN Human Rights Treaty monitoring bodies, we could also find that a number of UN human rights treaties have monitoring bodies to oversee the implementation of such treaties. The treaty bodies are composed of independent experts and meet to consider state parties, reports as well as individual complaints or communications. They may also publish general comments on human rights topics related to the treaties they oversee. The treaty-based bodies tend to follow similar patterns of documentation. When a nation ratifies the treaty, it undertakes both negative obligations, that is, to refrain from actions that violate human rights, and positive obligations, that is, to take affirmative actions to guarantee that human rights are protected. In order to ensure that governments are fulfilling both negative and positive obligations, the United Nations system includes a variety of enforcement mechanisms. Enforcement mechanisms are usually categorized by the type of UN body that receives communication or carries out the monitoring process. There are three broad categories of enforcement mechanisms. Firstly, charter-based mechanisms such as the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Secondly, convention or treaty-based mechanisms such as the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And thirdly, mechanisms contained in UN specialized agencies such as the International Labour Organization or the World Health Organization. Each of these bodies monitors either a specific human rights issue or particular treaties. The classification of enforcement mechanisms into these categories clarifies the workings of the UN structure. For women's rights advocates, However, it is generally more useful to understand the type of procedure available under each of the UN enforcement bodies, rather than the structural aspects of the mechanism. Some UN bodies accept complaints, that is usually referred to as communications, directly from private individuals or from NGOs on behalf of individuals. Depending on the body to which the complaint is submitted, one can choose between two types of complaints, each of which serves a different purpose. First, the complaint recourse procedure should be used when the victim is seeking redress for a specific human rights violation. The general purpose for submitting this type of complaint is to address individual grievances and advocate on behalf of the victim. The complaint procedure also serves to bring publicity to a specific case. Second, the complaint information procedure functions in a way similar to the reporting mechanisms. The purpose for submitting this type of complaint is to inform the appropriate UN body about broad human rights violations that affect large segments of the population. Eventually, for a communication, a complaint to be found admissible under a UN enforcement body, it is necessary to follow standard rules of procedure. Each monitoring body may have specific requirements for the form of communications, many of which can be accessed through the UN website on communications and complaints procedures. In addition, there are some general guidelines that are common to all enforcement bodies that may provide useful information for submitting a complaint. Each of the three types of UN bodies, charter-based mechanism, treaty-based mechanism, and specialized agencies, carry out human rights monitoring. In order to enforce the provisions of international treaties, the UN does not rely solely on the information about violations of human rights brought by individuals or NGOs. The human rights bodies themselves regularly monitor compliance with treaty obligations. Monitoring and reporting procedures differ from complaint mechanisms in that monitoring does not result in a legally binding decision, nor does it depend on information communicated by individuals or groups. When UN bodies undertake monitoring, they create a report on state non-compliance which includes specific authoritative but non-binding recommendations. There are two ways that the reporting and monitoring procedure can be initiated. Firstly, required state reporting. The 6 core human rights treaties are, that is, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, the Convention on the Eliminations of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Once a national government has ratified one of these treaties, it is required to report on a regular basis to the treaty monitoring body. States are under an obligation to report on their own compliance with the treaty, but the committees have no power to enforce this requirement. Thus, it is not unusual for national governments to miss reporting deadlines or fail to submit a report at all. Secondly, committee or NGO initiated reporting. Some UN monitoring bodies initiate a report on government action outside of the reporting schedule required by a treaty. In the case of the UN Special Rapporteurs, such as the Special Rapporteur on Violence against Women, the office initiates analysis of specific issues or developments which is published in a report. Alternatively, information from advocates and NGOs may bring a specific issue to the attention of a UN body, such as the Commission on the Status of Women, which will then carry out a study and issue recommendations. The role of advocates in the monitoring process is distinct from that in the complaint process. While there is no circumscribed procedure for communications, NGOs have effectively addressed various UN committees during reporting periods to raise awareness of women's rights. A number of UN committees have indicated that despite the lack of explicit provisions about NGO participation, committee members rely on NGO information to determine whether state parties are fulfilling obligations under specific treaties. The international treaty occupies the same significant status in the field of international law as the legislation occupies in the domestic state law. The global human rights treaties such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights 1966, and other relevant optional protocols to such covenants are the basic human rights treaties that constitute the International Bill of Human Rights. Such international treaties have also been further supplemented by various specialized UN human rights treaties dealing with different aspects of women's rights and freedoms. A number of special mechanisms are set in accordance with the international covenants and conventions, which are in true sense of term known as expert bodies or treaty monitoring bodies that can oversee the implementation and enforcement undertaken by the respective state party to the relevant treaty. Normally, the treaty bodies consist of independent and impartial members who are elected by the concerned state parties. There are a few such treaty monitoring bodies which are obligated to supervise and monitor the human rights issues, especially by reviewing the information received from all the reliable sources. To mention some of the treaty monitoring bodies are the Committee Against Torture, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Committee on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Committee on Enforced Disappearances. All of the treaty bodies are empowered to consider initial and periodic reports of states, parties on how they are implementing the provisions of the treaty. As we already have discussed that the UN General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council and their subsidiary bodies are concerned with formulations and application of human rights standards for women, yet the specialized monitoring bodies have been set up for monitoring the implementation of the various international conventions and declarations relating to women for protecting their rights and liberties. The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination provides for monitoring the measures taken by the state parties to implement the provisions relating to protecting the women's rights, and it is also required to examine the reports submitted by various state parties in this regard, and if needed, the state parties are advised to maintain a uniform standard so that women's rights can effectively be protected. The Human Rights Committee is mainly concerned in monitoring the implementation of all the provisions relating to women in International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its optional protocol. The Human Rights Committee receives and considers the communications from women who claim to be victims of any violation of rights set forth in the ICCPR. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women was established in 1982 to monitor the implementation of the provisions of the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. The committee also prepares annual reports for the consideration of the General Assembly in relation to the protection of women's rights. The main concern of the Committee Against Torture lies with monitoring the implementation of the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1984. The committee under Article 20 of the Convention is authorized to make confidential inquiries in agreement with other state parties when it receives reliable information indicating that torture against women is being practiced systematically in the territory of any state party. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights was established to monitor the implementation of the provisions relating to women in regard to their economic, social and cultural rights consisted in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The Committee on the Rights of the Child was established in 1991 by the state parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Therefore, all the UN Human Rights Treaty monitoring bodies are taking an active role for the protection of the interests of the women all over the world, and its sole and main aim is to always uplift the status and liberty of women so that this world will become a safe and healthy place for all the human beings to live peacefully. With all the discussions we had, now we can conclude that we have discussed the roles of UN human rights based bodies as well as the UN Human Rights Treaty monitoring bodies for protection of women's rights. However, one fact we must understand is that the monitoring bodies in actual sense have no real enforcing power besides applying international pressure on states. The continued and heightened interaction between the monitoring bodies, and other United Nations organizations, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and non-governmental organizations, however, offers much hope in this regard. In the present world, there are several significant documents and implementation mechanisms in place that guarantee and protect the equal rights of women and men. Through the work of the United Nations, women's rights, along with the broader area of human rights, have been wrestled away from the domestic sphere and placed into the international arena. In the United Nations, women's groups from all over the world now have a forum in which it is continuously trying to promote the equality of women and women's right to that of men.